This story took place in the small American town of Ravenhall, which was famous for its old Victorian houses, thick forests, and, most sinister of all, Whistle Hill Cemetery. Locals avoided this gloomy place, especially after sundown. The cemetery was said to be haunted, and those who ventured there returned with gray hair or disappeared altogether. Jessica Harper, a student from a neighboring town, came to Ravenhall for the weekend to spend time with her friends, Thomas and Rachel. They've loved exploring mystical places since childhood, and rumors about Whistle Hill Cemetery intrigued them. Thomas teased, picking up the lantern. "Come on, Jess, you're not afraid of old tales, are you?" "Of course not," Jessica replied, though she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Rachel smiled and said, "They say you can see a guardian in the cemetery. It's a kind of spirit that guards the dead. If you piss him off, he'll take you back to his world." "Good," Thomas grinned. It seemed like a good time to see if it was true. They headed toward the cemetery, despite the thick fog that shrouded the area. The gates of Whistle Hill creaked as if to protest their intrusion. There was an oppressive silence in the cemetery, broken only by the rustle of the wind in the withered trees. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. Thomas whistled playfully, but his voice was lost in the thick air. "Look," Rachel whispered, pointing to an old crypt in the center of the cemetery. The stone walls were covered with moss, and the door bore an engraved inscription that read, "Do not disturb the dead." "That sounds like an invitation," Thomas hummed and headed toward the crypt. Jessica felt a muffled fear, but followed her friends. When Thomas pushed open the door, there was a resounding creak, as if the cemetery itself had come to life. The inside of the crypt smelled damp and decaying. An old book with worn pages lay on the floor. "Is that a grimoire?" Rachel asked in surprise, gingerly picking it up. On one of the pages were strange symbols and words in an unknown language. Thomas, without thinking, said a few phrases. Suddenly an icy wind rose around them, the lantern flame flickered, and an invisible force slammed the crypt door shut. Jessica screamed, but her voice was drowned out by a deafening roar. When the wind died down, it was completely dark inside the crypt. Only the faint moonlight filtered through the cracks in the walls. Jessica heard heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. "Who's there?" Rachel asked in a trembling voice. Her face was pale and her hands were clutching a book. The answer was a low, husky voice that seemed both close and distant at the same time. "You have disturbed the peace. Now you will pay." A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and contorted. Its eyes glowed a dead green, and bony hands were visible from beneath a long cloak. "It's the Guardian!" Jessica whispered, stepping back. "Run!" Thomas shouted, but the crypt door was locked. The figure raised its hand, and whispers rang through the air, like the voices of the many dead. The floor beneath their feet began to crack, and long, dry hands reached out of the cracks trying to grab them. Rachel, trembling, opened the book and began to read the spell, hoping to stop the Guardian. The words were difficult, but she managed to say them all the way through. Everything was quiet for a moment, and then the crypt door swung open. "Run!" Jessica shouted. They sprinted out into the cemetery, but it had changed. There were stone statues everywhere that hadn't been there before. They looked like people frozen in terror. "This isn't the right world," Thomas whispered. The Guardian appeared again, but he was not alone. Behind him stood figures that looked like statues, only they moved unnaturally fast. "You cannot leave," his voice boomed. "This world is your home now." The next morning, the locals found 3 things at the cemetery gate: an old lantern, a shabby book, and a smartphone with a broken screen. But Jessica, Thomas, and Rachel were never seen again. They say if you go back to Whistle Hill at night, you can hear their voices whispering from the depths of the cemetery, begging for help. And the statues, if you look closely, look suspiciously familiar.